So it's my pleasure to introduce founder of the Basic Income Earth Network, Guy Standing. Professor Guy Standing has been a part of a myriad of universal basic income and basic security research projects around the world. Some projects delve into practical household surveys, of which he designed and conducted in over 25 countries. This experience and groundwork is what also makes Standing an ever-developing thinker of the 21st century. His wit and commitment to social equality has made him an approachable economist. The basis of Standing's research is that in our current climate, we do not have the basic security and therefore we do not have full freedom. He is influential and forward-thinking in his research about the dangerous new class, the Precariat. This is something that many of us can relate to, having precarious work and not finding much meaning in it. He also explores the plunder of the commons, a historical account and reasoning of the commons. He shows here the intersection of economics and ecology. In general, Guy Standing's work is all about the endeavour for full freedom for all. Please welcome Professor Guy Standing.
Very much. It's a pleasure to be back in Melbourne, even if only virtually. I spent a lot of time there earlier in the century, and it's one of my favourite cities in the world. I'm going to approach this as a talk for a bookshop, and therefore talk about books, because what I'm going to say is the narrative I've been saying through a series of books. Never planned it as such, but it's turned out that this has been the way I can convey the perspective I develop. And it really goes back to when I completed my PhD in Cambridge and I started working for the United Nations. And I was on and off director of research, director of socioeconomic security, and conducting research all over the world over the course of 30 years. And early on, I also helped set up the Basic Income European Network, as it was at the beginning, which then became the Basic Income Earth Network. We wanted to keep the bien, and has attracted thousands of people to the network from all over the world, including good friends in Australia. And it's been my sort of career defining set of messages around basic income. But it started with the neoliberal economics revolution at the end of the 1970s. I was immediately convinced that the neoliberalism of Thatcher and Reagan, the World Bank, and the Washington Consensus was going to usher in a period of growing inequality, growing insecurity, and basically reflected the beginnings of a global transformation. Those of you who are familiar with Karl Polanyi's book, The Great Transformation, will know the essential thesis of that. And I believed that this marked the end of Polanyi's Great Transformation, and we were beginning a disembedded phase of a new transformation in which a global market economy was being constructed. Now, from the beginning, the neoliberalism was based on a fundamental lie. It was based on the lie that they believed in free markets and untrammeled free markets. This was always untrue because they proceeded to construct a regulatory system, a fiscal and monetary system, and a system of property rights that triumphed over any form of free market. And in fact, I've argued in one of the books, The Corruption of Capitalism, that in fact what they did was begin a process of creating the most unfree market economy ever envisaged. And the argument that I've been developing is that basically what they were doing is creating institutions and mechanisms of privilege and ushered in a period of rentier capitalism. Rentier capitalism in which more and more of the income and wealth being generated around the world would be flowing to the owners of property, financial property, physical property, and intellectual property. And therefore, the share of income going to people who performed labor and work, to come back to, was going to decline and has declined, and it's a well-known stylized fact from around the world that has been the case. And the creation of rentier capitalism was defined by one of the most extraordinary phenomenon in world history: systematic financialization. What this means in lay terms is that an incredible amount of income being generated and being accumulated has gone to finance. So we've got a situation today where in a country like Britain, financial assets are worth over 1,000% of national income. In many other countries, rich countries and middle income countries, the financial assets are worth over 500%. That's a huge bypassed standards. And at the same time as financialization has taken place, they established an intellectual property rights regime, which came to fruition in 1994 with the passage just down the road from where I'm sitting outside Geneva, the passage of TRIPS, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. And what this did under the aegis of US multinational pharmaceutical, financial companies, and so on, was globalize the US intellectual property rights system. And therefore, what happened was between 1994, when under 1 million patents were filed around the world, to say last year, when the latest data are available, over 3 million patents are filed every year. Now, for someone who's not familiar with that, what patents do is they give a monopoly profit to the owner of the patent of 20 years, in pharmaceutical 40 years. And this, of course, is contrary to anything remotely called a free market. It gives a monopoly to a single corporation or a single individual. Bill Gates should go down every day and pray to TRIPS, pray. And so should most of the billionaires in the world. Because what's happened is that plutocratic corporations have bought up, the term is hoovered, patents from around the world, strung them together, and turned them into the biggest rent-seeking mechanism of history. And this has intensified this whole system of rentier capitalism. Same with copyright. Copyright used to be that if someone like an author would take out copyright, you had protection for 14 years, which if you were still alive at the end of that, you could apply for a further 14 years. That was a principle established in 1710. But the TRIPS has made copyright for 70 years beyond your death. You have copyright for the whole of your life and 70 years. And in the United States, it's gone to 95 years. So it's turned copyright into an incredible rent-seeking activity. I want to go further into that because I've got to get to the chase. But you can see that rentier capitalism created this dysfunctional inequality. Now, what happened is that this ushered in two key parts of my narrative. The first, which I'd actually started writing about back in the 1980s, at which I was not able to articulate it in the way I wanted to while working in the United Nations, where I was accumulating information, is the growth of a new global class structure. And that global class structure is fundamentally different from the old Marxian ideas of the 19th century and Marxist variants through much of the 20th century. But it doesn't mean that class has disappeared. It means that we must analyze the current political and economic developments through the prism of class, through the perspective of class. And of course, the class system that's emerging and has emerged in the last 30 years has a plutocracy. It's not a top 1%, it's much less than that, of obscenely wealthy and powerful global citizens, the plutocracy, an elite underneath them serving their interests, making multi-millions and so on, and getting most of their income from rental mechanisms, a salariat that is shrinking, people with employment security, pensions, paid holidays, all that stuff, which was meant to be the majority by the end of the 20th century, but has now been shrinking everywhere. Underneath is the old proletariat. I always think of Melbourne as being the proletarian city of Australia, just as you can identify certain cities and towns in England as the proletarian centres. But of course, the proletariat has been shrinking, the agenda of the proletariat has been shrinking, and the political legitimacy and power has been shrinking. It's underneath that this precariat has developed, and underneath the precariat are lumpen, the people dying in the streets and so on. They're not part of the precariat. Now, the precariat is the key of the two books I wrote, the one that Maddie's just mentioned, The Precariat, the New Dangerous Class, and I wrote a subsequent book saying, well, if you're part of the precariat, what would be your political agenda? What would it look like? And how would it differ from the proletariat agenda 100 years ago? I leave that aside because I want to define the precariat because it's very, very important for understanding the reactions to the pandemic and the arguments for basic income. I never define the precariat as people doing precarious work, a term I hate as it happens, or precarious labor. The precariat can be defined in three dimensions: distinctive relations of production, distinctive relations of distribution, and distinctive relations to the state. That's why I think it's a class. The distinctive relations of production are that you're going to have a life of unstable labor, bits and pieces lives, no sense of a career narrative, no sense of being in control of your time, and having to do a lot of work for labor and work for the state that doesn't get counted, doesn't get remunerated, doesn't get recognized. But if you're in the precariat, you have to do a lot of it. That is a defining feature of being in the precariat. And therefore, this loss of sense of control of time leads to what I've called in the books the precariatized mind. You don't know what's the best options, how you should spend your time, etc. The second dimension is that you have to rely almost entirely on money wages that have been falling in real value terms, that are more and more uncertain, more and more volatile, and you don't get access to the labor-based forms of labor security that the proletariat had built up after the Second World War, particularly with the Beveridge and Bismarckian systems of social security. If you're in the precariat, you don't have those. And you are being exploited as much off jobs and outside workplaces as inside jobs and inside labor time. You're exploited by rentier mechanisms. Everybody knows if you're in the precariat that you're living on the edge of unsustainable debt. One accident, one mistake, one missed opportunity, and you're likely to end out in the streets and join the lumpen precariat. So you suffer from a sense of uncertainty and chronic 4 A's, as I've called it in the book: anxiety, alienation, anomie, and anger. And those 4 A's have been very critical in defining what's been happening to the precariat since I wrote the book. That book was written in 2011 and has been translated into 24 languages and many editions and so on. It's transformed my life as much as anybody else's. But every single day, without exception, I get emails from somewhere, from somebody who's read that book or the sequel and say, this book's about me. I am part of the precariat. And that leads to the third critical aspect of being in the precariat. You are a denizen, not a citizen, in the sense that you are losing rights all the time. Sometimes you don't realize it until you have need of those rights, but usually you do know what's happening. You're losing economic rights, you're losing social rights, you're losing cultural rights, you're losing civil rights. You don't have due process. You get punished. You get sanctioned. You don't have access to legal equality, common law. And the ultimate critical definitional point is that if you're in the precariat, you feel like and are a supplicant. The original Latin root of the term is for precarious and precarity is to obtain by prayer. That sums it up. For me, this is the most critical aspect of the growth of the precariat. Now, before I go on, let me say that I argued in the Precariat book on page 1, 2011, I said, unless the precariat is understood and their aspirations and needs addressed, we will see the emergence of a political monster. And you will not be surprised that in November 2016, I received a lot of emails from a lot of different nationalities telling me that my monster had arrived. And what I did in the Precariat Charter in particular is I said, look, there are 3 variants in the precariat, which is why it's only a class in the making, not yet a class for itself, not unified. The first part I call the atavists. These are people without a lot of education who fall into the precariat from the old working class, if you like, and they feel they've lost the past. They've lost what their parents had or they had, and they're angry, and they listen to the sirens of populism. They listen to Trump, they listen to Morrison, they listen to Boris Johnson, promising to bring back yesterday. This part of the precariat is dangerous because it's ushering in neo-fascism, which is what I argued. The second part of the precariat consists mainly of migrants, people who are real denizens, and they don't have a present. They don't have a home. That's why I call them nostalgics, a lost sense of home. These people won't join the populists, but they also won't take political action very easily. They keep their heads down, they have to survive. The third part of the precariat I call the progressives, because these are the young who've gone to college, got a good education. They were promised by their parents and their teachers and themselves that if they did all that, they would have a future. And yet they come out of university or college without a sense of future, with huge debts, disillusioned by not having a sense of future. But they won't vote for the populists. But what's been happening with this group is they won't vote for the old Social Democrats either. Why should they? They don't want that old laborist history. They want a future in which survival, in which to have a commons, in which to be able to do work, not just labor, work that is unpaid, work like voluntary, civil work, care work, community work. And this sense of a denied future is why this part of the precariat has not been voting. They stayed at home for Brexit. They stayed at home when it was between Hillary Clinton and Trump. They stayed at home in many, many other places. But at the moment, we need to revive a politics of paradise, as I called it in that first book. And the politics of paradise must be built on the economic flaws of the system that's been built up under rentier capitalism. So I wrote a book called Basic Income and How We Can Make It Happen. My argument throughout my writing is that fundamentally a basic income, which was a modest basic payment that every individual paid as an economic right, non-withdrawable, without conditions, is an economic right. And it's a matter of ethics. It should be seen as a commons dividend, a social dividend. Because fundamentally, the justification for having a basic income as an anchor of a new income distribution system is not only that the old system has broken down, but that it is a matter of common justice. The wealth and income of all of us, every single one of us, every single person I'm looking at right now, is far, far more to do with the efforts and achievements of previous generations than anything we do ourselves. And it is pure conceit to think that somehow we are merit-worthy and we deserve more than others. It's just not actually correct. And if you allow for private inheritance of private riches, which is what all governments do, and have been phasing out inheritance taxes everywhere, if you allow that, which is a lot of something for nothing, if I may put it that way, as the politicians like to talk about, then so we should think of as basic income as a social dividend, a commons dividend of the achievements of our ancestors. And I don't know whose ancestor contributed more or less, and therefore the only equitable way is that it should be equal for all as a right. The second ethical justification for basic income is that it would enhance freedom. It would enhance libertarian freedom, the freedom to make choices, the freedom to be a consumer. But more importantly, it would enhance liberal freedom, the freedom to be moral, the freedom to be able to make decisions based on morality and your own ethical values rather than out of necessity and desperation. That is an important form of freedom. It's the freedom to say no. And the third form of freedom is Republican freedom. The sense that you must be free from the power of unaccountable authority. It's not freedom for a woman if she has to ask permission from her husband or partner before she can do something, even if he's the most benevolent husband and always in practice says yes. That's not the point. Republican freedom is the freedom to make that decision yourself without others telling you yes or no. We did a pilot basic income in India, big one, with over 6,000 people. I remember that going down to one of the villages, and I noticed at the beginning that all the young women had to wear veils. We had to get cards made so that they received their basic income each month. We had cards for it. And we had to arrange for all the women to go into a hut and have their photos taken by women. About 9 or 10 months later, I went back to that particular village. And I said to one of my Indian colleagues, I said, "Have you noticed anything?" He said, "No." I said, "Look at the women. None of them are wearing veils." So I called some women across and we asked them, said, "We've noticed this change. Can you explain it?" And they were a bit nervous and timid to start with, but then one of them spoke up and said, "Well, it's like this. Before, we had to ask And we had to do as the elders told us. Today, with our basic income, we can make the decisions ourselves. Even more poignantly, we did a pilot in Africa, mainly in Namibia. And at the end of the pilot, I asked some young women to come and talk to me. And I said, what's been the best thing about having a basic income? What's been the best thing for you? And they were also nervous and giggled. And eventually one of them plucked up courage and said, well, before, when the men came down from the fields at the end of the months with their pockets full of their wages, we had to say yes. Now we have our basic income, we say no. That's freedom. That's freedom. And that's what it's about. And the third ethical reason is that a basic income, even if very modest, less than subsistence, it enhances basic security. Basic security is a human need. And it's also a public good, in the sense that you having basic security doesn't deprive me of having basic security. That's the nature of a private good. A public good is when all of us can have it. And the value of basic security to each and every one of us is enhanced by everybody having it. You can work that out. Basic security enhances the mental capacities. I document that with psychological and other evidence in the book. So these three ethical reasons are the main reasons I've always supported basic income. But then I wrote the latest book because last year I was asked by the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell in Britain, to be, he'd invited me several years earlier and I had been working with him, and he said, Guy, I'm converted. I want us to do pilots. I want us to move to basic income. Can you produce a report for us? I produced that report, and then subsequently a publisher said, please, we've got to turn this into a book. And the thesis of the book was this, is this. Rentier capitalism had generated 8 giants. And this was playing on a theme made famous by William Beveridge in his 1942 report that most people know about, but few have bothered to read. Understandably, it's very boring, to be honest. And on page 2 of that report, he was hardly a radical, but he said, this is a not, and the before slave giants, ignorance, and my thesis was that we have 8 modern giants that have been created by rentier capitalism and the new class structure. And these 8 giants are going to lead to an incredibly fragile economic system where just one major shock of some sort will tip it into a global crisis. And the 8 giants are inequality, particularly wealth inequality, which is greater than at any time in recorded history. Insecurity, which is chronic, which is mainly about uncertainty. It is a pandemic in itself. Millions and millions of people feel insecure all the time. Debt, private debt. And one of the extraordinary aspects of this pandemic is that the last time the world had a comparable medical pandemic was the Spanish flu of 1918, 1920. And the Spanish flu didn't result in a global slump. And part of the reason was that there was greater economic resilience in the system at the time. private debt was only 50% of US GDP, for example. There was no real corporate debt. And those two are what make an economy fragile. Before this pandemic, private debt in the United States was well over 100%, and corporate debt was 3/4 of national income. So it made the system much more fragile. But private debt is a wanted aspect of rentier capitalism. The financial institutions want us all to be in debt, and particularly the Precariat, because they pay astronomical rates of interest. And it's the source of their basic income for the financial institutions. So private debt creates an incredibly fragile economic system. You only need a small decline and you're in big trouble. The fourth is stress. The fourth giant is stress. It's one of the strange phenomenon that millions of people feel stressed out of their mind. They suffer from related illnesses, cardiac problems, cancers, through stress. Stress is a major cause of lost labor time, we know, and so on. Stress is part of the fragility of society and is a cause of the eighth giant. The fifth is precarity, the sense of losing rights, being supplicants. Millions feel like that. The sixth, of course, is the robots, the threat of automation. I do not believe the robots are going to make all of us have nothing to do. I don't believe in the lump of labor fallacy, but I do believe, and it's a lot of evidence, that this technological revolution is creating an extraordinary disruptive dislocation and increasing rentier incomes and increasing inequality. So it's a fundamental giant. It needn't be the threat it is, but it is, in the current system, it is a threat. The big giant, as I argued in the book, and it makes me even more convinced by the pandemic, is the threat of extinction. And of course, the irony of this pandemic is that it's revealing that that threat of extinction is not just to nature, not just to birds and fish and all the nature that we love, it's to ourselves. Because we have been behaving in a predatory manner towards nature in such a way that we ourselves are endangered by the viruses coming back at us. But the threat of extinction, I believe, will be the tipping point for making millions more support basic income. Because we need eco-taxes, we need substantial eco-taxes, but they will only be accepted if you deal with the regressive aspects, the fears that the poor are paying more than the rich. If you recycle the revenues and pay for the basic income, it becomes a popular policy. And that's why I think the need for eco-taxes and the need for basic income go together. But furthermore, we know that we must encourage forms of work that are not resource-depleting labor. Let us remove the fetish of jobs, jobs, jobs. Most of the most rewarding and valuable forms of work are unpaid, unremunerated. The care work that women have borne for generations should be something we all share. The feelings of relating to nature, the feelings of slowing down, the feelings of leisure in its proper Greek sense, which I tried to discuss in the books. For me, the very agenda around extinction and the degrowth is playing into the hands of a need for basic income. And the eighth giant, of course, is the one that is scaring even the plutocrats in Silicon Valley and at Davos, where for some reason I've been invited to talk for 3 years in a row, the threat of neo-fascist populism. We don't want a repeat of the 1930s. Trump is playing the same cards as they played in the 1930s, Hitler, Mussolini, et al. He's doing it very explicitly, very crudely. We must realize that what he's doing, others are doing in cleverer ways, if you like. He is so visible and disgusting that we can see the evil. But note, millions of people are supporting him. And unless we have a politics of paradise to entice more people to become active in an egalitarian way and induce some of those who support the Trumps to come away from that, come away from the disgusting agenda that it represents, back into a revival of the future. And for me, this is the critical point where we are today. And the last point I want to make is this. The Precariat is mobilizing. The various elements of a progressive agenda are coming together. Basic income or any other policy is not a panacea. It has to be seen as a package. It has to be seen as an agenda that is different from the past. And in that, I regret enormously that over the last 15 years, quite a lot of old leftists have written and said horrible things about me. I mean, attacking me and calling me a traitor to the working class, all this nonsense. And I think we must be more unified, the progressive part. The warts we all have are minor compared to what is exhibited by the neoliberals and those advocating so-called free markets. And we must have a more active involvement in forging this sense of the future. I think it can come. This is a transformative moment, but we're not stupid enough to think the dangers of neo-fascism aren't just as strong. We have to win it. And that's why I think all of us have to be active. And thank you very much for listening to me.
As I've muted them all, but I'm sure they are. We'll open it up to questions. And the first question is from Jerry. So I'll just unmute you, Jerry.
Hello.
Yeah.
Right, can I start? Can you hear?
Yeah, good. I can hear you.
Right, thank you, Guy. Look, I'm an economist who's long been of support prior to the neoliberal. I'm old enough to remember before the neoliberal agenda take force, and there was a large economic support for what was called the guaranteed minimum income scheme, and it seemed like an economically justifiable and valid approach to run a more efficient economy. Now, the problem was even Milton Friedman was a supporter of guaranteed minimum income scheme because he saw it as efficient from the right because he wanted to take all other rights away and just give them a guaranteed minimum income. So what my question is about the mechanism of a UBI. I've been a supporter. I've read Rutger Bregman's Utopia for Realists, who shows that practicality of actually happening in the past. But recently I read a book by Boris Frankel, who's a colleague here in Melbourne, who's written a book on the fictions of sustainability. And there was a whole chapter having trenchant criticism of the UBI, not for all the good reasons. You painted a picture that Boris Frankel would also support, and I do too. But he was on the practical politics of it, that the politics of paradise is not practical, that there are too many on the left arguing for many paradises, and the economics situation from the neoliberal makes it impractical to start at a UBI perspective, because basically you've got too many forces of capitalism against you to even start. And what Frankel says, you don't start with income, you start at production, which you also mentioned. And he argues you've got to start with social care, you've got to start with people backing you, from migrants and all, from a production point of view, and work from work and production, and work up that way to create a paradise of production, not a paradise of income.
Maddie, shall I respond briefly?
Yes, please.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for the question. I get variants of that from around the world a lot, obviously, and I've addressed it frontally in the book, Basic Income and How We Can Make It Happen. I've addressed precisely your points. I think the difference between a basic income and the guaranteed minimum income that advocated by Friedman and through a negative income tax and by a number of social democrats is that fundamentally what they had was a means-tested based system, okay, which is what we call social assistance. And you automatically create poverty traps with that approach, because you have moral and immoral hazards. Anybody who's below poverty line, who gets the benefits, has a disincentive to take any low-wage job, because they would lose the benefits and they would have effectively a marginal tax rate of 80% or more. So that's the classic. And it's worsened by what I've called the Precariat trap. That if you have to wait for benefits, you have to qualify for benefits, and you're only getting short-term jobs, you can work it out very quickly that you're not ever going to have any incentive to take any of those jobs, because you would lose far more. So I think that the arguments for a guaranteed minimum income of the variety that's been talked about is gone forever. But leave that aside. I would like to direct the answer to your skepticism to a book by Albert Hirschman, wonderful book. And what he did was he looked at all social policies, all progressive social policies that he could think of that have been brought up at various times. And every single time, the arguments that you've just given were produced against it, often from the left. You can't have unemployment benefits because this. You can't have pensions because this. Same sort of things, okay? And then he says, as soon as they're introduced, those objections just disappear, okay? Because it becomes part of a new system. For me, the defining issue of our moment is that we are learning one big lesson. We are learning the lesson that the resilience of society will depend on the resilience of the weakest components of society. And unless we have a quasi-universal form of basic security for everybody in society, we will not escape times of pandemics. This is already the 6th pandemic of the century, and we know from all the research that's shown that there will be other pandemics, there will be other shocks, there will be other financial crises. And unless we have resilience across the board, we will all lack resilience, and society and the economy will lack resilience. I think this has changed the psyche of the debate on basic income. We now have seen opinion polls across the European Union and in Britain, which is showing 75%, 73% support for basic income. That's a fundamental change from 10 years ago, 2 years ago. Okay, we've been growing in support, but nothing like this. And the sense of needing a new income distribution system, given what's happened with rentier capitalism, has changed the dynamics. So many of those people arguing that you've cited have actually become out of date with the context that we're facing at this moment. I believe that if people have basic security, they fight stronger for other things in society that we all value. If you have basic security, you are prepared to stand up for other things. If you're chronically insecure, you daren't do that. You get blacklisted and all sorts of other fears come to the top. I think now it's moved from being an ethically desirable policy to being an economic imperative and a political imperative. And I think that's a big change compared with when I was first advocating basic income many years ago.
Great. I have a quick question from Hans that they'd like me to read out. Do you agree on what German economist Gustav Schuller said some 130 years ago? Above all, however, if there is to be a full division of labour somewhere, social institutions must provide the maintenance, food, clothing and housing of those who devote all their labour to others. Isn't basic income more a consequence of division of labour than a human right?
I mean, I find this sort of argument just not useful, in the sense that I don't like posing things as alternatives to other. A person who says, well, won't a basic income jeopardize the National Health Service? Shouldn't we spend more money on the National Health Service rather than give basic income? Should, you know, this sort of argument. We need both. We need different institutions to strengthen voice, in the Hirschman sense of voice, collective bargaining strength. We need institutions that can extend the commons. That's why I wrote the book, Plunder of the Commons. We need to revive the commons as a fundamental part of a progressive agenda. And we need to have a new income distribution system. In response to Jerry's point, which I didn't respond to, but it relates to this as well, what is interesting now is that the productive part and the better people in capitalism are coming round to the recognition that the system that they've got cannot continue. They know it's morally repugnant and not acceptable. And many of them have come round to saying, look, we need to pay higher taxes and we need to have basic income, because otherwise people will go and vote for fascists and so on. So that they're actually open to the agenda of a new income distribution system. But that, of course, is not a panacea. It's only a necessity. And I think that's the argument I would make about it at the moment from an economic point of view.
Great. And next we have up Sean.
Kia ora, Guy. How are you?
Okay.
Good. I'm listening in from Dunedin, New Zealand. I want to point out that I met you in Christchurch in 2015, and I asked you a question about Barack Obama's inaugural address, asking about leisure. I've got a different question for you that I've just posted in the chat. I'll just read it out. The Opportunities Party, or CHOP, are running on a basic income policy in October's the 17th election. And I want to ask, are you and any participants listening open to making contact and offering support to this party in some way to ensure we gain traction? And what questions do you have of us to bring this about? I want to point out that we have a Facebook page and we have a policy chat. We have a leader's email address that I can send with you. There might be some protocols that you might need to be apolitical or something that can precautions that you have, but I just want to ask, because at the moment we're polling it around 1.5%, and we have to get 5% and or an electorate seat to get into Parliament. And this is one opportunity to make traction on basic income in New Zealand. So I just want to tap your brain and get some feedback from you about that. Thanks.
Well, I love New Zealand, and I've been there quite a few times, and I've interacted with Grant Robertson, your finance minister, who has told me several times that he's a convert to basic income. And I told him when he became the finance minister, I said, now's your opportunity. And I think he's a good man. And I think you've got a great prime minister. And that we need to see the basic income debate in New Zealand move more centrally. We've got a very good network there, lovely people, friends, and so on, that are cross-party. I think that in New Zealand, possibly like in Australia, that we will probably make more progress if we advocate basic income pilots in certain areas, particularly areas hit by natural disasters or something like that, or Maori areas where, in fact, we had a huge number of discussions, I remember, in Auckland about advocating for a Maori area to be a pilot area for basic income, because they're most impoverished, most insecure, most prone to social illnesses, etc. So, I mean, I personally don't know enough about the current political maneuverings by the different factions, but I always thought there's a strong possibility, particularly with Grant around, that in fact there will come a moment when enough people will put enough pressure to have a real move in that direction. New Zealand has always been a pioneer of social policy, going back to 1892. So it's possible in New Zealand.
Wonderful. All right, our next person that we have is David.
Can't hear you, Maddie.
Okay. Would it be possible maybe to set up an interview just for a few minutes, maybe? Would that be possible?
Sorry?
Would it be okay to set up an interview with some Czech people that we have?
Yeah, in principle, yeah. I'm having difficulty hearing you, sorry. But
okay.
If you're talking about an interview, yeah, no problem.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great.
All right, next up we have David.
Oh, hello, Guy. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm trying to see your face. I'm trying to.
You see me now?
Oh, I got you. See you.
Okay. Yeah. Off that subject a little bit, and onto the issue of affordability. Could UBI be funded by creating of new money or modern monetary theory, which seems so simplistic and eliminates the need to do all of that tax tweaking and all manner of computations and calculations to convince naysayers that it can be afforded? The rationale is to have a deficit is quite okay, we know that, and in 2 or 3 years of implementation, basic income would pay for itself, do you think? And upon implementation of UBI, we then do a tax reform big time. So what do you think of that, Guy?
Well, it gives me an opportunity. Your question gives me an opportunity to talk about the I think it should be for. I believe that in the current circumstances of this pandemic, which is affecting the whole world, we need something like an emergency basic income paid out of budget deficit, because governments are spending billions of dollars or pounds or whatever, propping up the financial markets. If they redirected part of that, they could easily pay for an emergency basic income for as long as the pandemic continues. Instead of which they've been wasting vast amounts in helping the middle classes and the financial markets through fancy furlough schemes and everything, which are increasing inequalities. I'm really frustrated by that sense of direction. But the longer term, we need to create a different fiscal system, tax reform, shift from taxing earned incomes to taxing wealth and ecological bads, essentially. And I've argued in Plunder of the Commons that the essence of the plunder is that systematically finance and private capital has been taking our commons. That common belongs to all of us. It belongs to all of us as equals. And therefore, we should set up a commons capital fund, which would be modeled on the Alaska Permanent Fund or better still, the Norwegian Pension Fund, which accumulates and builds up from levies, the taking of the commons. And I've got 17 levies specified in the book. And by that means, you can create a commons capital fund, have it an ecological investment strategy for, and then you distribute the dividends to everybody as common dividends, form of basic income. And the good feature of that is that it's morally and politically feasible, in the sense that if I explain what I've just done at length on the commons to a middle class, middle values audience, as I was doing just before the pandemic struck, they get it just as much as young members of the Precariat get it. Agenda built around reviving the commons and compensating commoners for the loss of the illegal loss of commons, be the air, be the water, be the land, be the resources, be our amenities, be our social commons, our civil commons, and so on, and a fund of compensatory payments and then distributing payments is a feasible, affordable, legitimate way of rebalancing capitalism. And I think the agenda built around reviving the commons fits very well and gets rid of the skepticism from some old left types, because we need to revive the commons, and the old left didn't revive the commons. They didn't. They thought the state could do everything. But the commons is much more general and much more understood by us as human beings. And I think that that's the way forward. That doesn't mean I disagree with what you were saying. I think that there are monetary mechanisms as well. Okay, I tend to steer clear of the blockchain cryptocurrency debates, although a lot of my friends in Bien are doing very interesting work, and I'm an advisor to a PhD on this, so I'm learning all the time, and I have a feeling that there's a lot in that. But I'm more interested in reviving the commons as part of this progressive strategy and using that as a way of legitimizing basic income across the political spectrum. You won't get to the far right, but that doesn't matter. I think we can force them into a silo around this notion of the commons. Question.
Great, we have a couple last questions. Next is Ralph.
I have to look around.
Hello. Thank you for your contribution and for the contributions of others. My question, in a sense, has to do with the international context, and I'm thinking of it particularly in terms of the example of Denmark, where there is growing resentment towards refugees being entitled to Danish social benefits, which are basically cradle to grave. In a world with many immigrants, how does the state convince its citizens to allow access to universal basic income for incomers?
Well, for some strange reason, I get invited, well, before the pandemic, I get invited to Denmark more than any other country to speak about the Precariat. And I was invited by the cabinet of the government 18 months ago. And the Prime Minister was sitting right in front of me, Prime Minister of Denmark. And I said that there must be two Denmarks in the world, because you and your ministers say there is no precariat in the country. Our welfare system is working wonderfully. And yet my books have been translated into Danish, and a huge number of people ask me to talk to precariat groups, and it must be a different country. Now, the thing is that Denmark is a small country which, in a sense, is on the edge of rentier capitalism. It has the highest percentage of households in private debt than any other country. It's extraordinary. So it's actually on a knife edge. Its welfare system is in crisis, and a large number of people are not getting the sort of state benefits that they've been expecting and that advertised around the world as Denmark, a great place. Hillary Clinton was even seduced by the idea of Denmark. But the point is that this resentment of migrants has grown as a result of the flaking of the Danish welfare system. And the income distribution is going worse and worse. And the situation is getting close to crisis. I never use the term, if you notice, universal basic income. I do not, constantly people say, standing advocate of universal basic income. I never use the term. And the reason I don't use the term is that for pragmatic political reasons, you'd have to have some rules on entitlement. Otherwise, politically, we're dead in the water. Otherwise, it would be a chaos. You would have to say that this basic income would only apply to usual legal residents of the country, and that people coming in who are legal migrants would have to wait for a period before they qualify for it, right? And I, as a non-resident of the United Kingdom, I don't live in the United Kingdom, so therefore I would not be entitled. So it's not universal of all citizens. I'm a citizen, but I'm not a resident. So you have to have some rules. That does not mean you do not give refugees or undocumented people assistance. You need to do that. Any decent society has to do that. But you treat it as a separate issue. You treat it as a separate issue. Not everything can be fitted into playing golf with one club. You need to have many clubs. And this, I think, is an important reason why I think the term universal is not very helpful. It sets up, as we say, hares running unnecessarily. And I believe that social dividends, common dividends, and basic income are all viable terms. I hope that responds to your question.
Next up, we have Comrade from Search.
G'day, Guy. G'day, everybody. My name is Luke Whitington. I'm the Executive Officer of the Search Foundation, which is the co-host for tonight's event. Thank you very much for joining us, and thanks to Maddie and everyone for being there. I'm also have been an activist pushing UBI with the New South Wales Labor Party since around 2015. I've moved a number of motions at various places as the Deputy Chair of the Economic Policy Committee. And I wanted to get your reaction to what Yanis Varoufakis said in his 2016 presentation about UBI, which I've posted in the chat, that UBI is the only way to save the social democratic fiscal model, which has been destroyed by financialisation. And whether that is a way to convince some of the old Democrats who are obviously very attached to the old fiscal, the welfare state, and in many respects the Sanders and Corbyn phenomenon is in some respects a hearkening for the old social democratic fiscal setup. Just to bring it to the Australian context, John Quiggin, the economics professor from UQ, who's a supporter of UBI, I'm sure you know him, has said that the first step to a UBI in Australia, and as a way to get Social Democrats on side and get popular support, would be to take away some of the restrictions on the age pension, to make it a bit more like it is in New Zealand, where there's easier access to it, and to expand the youth payments. So take away some of the very onerous restrictions on young people receiving, OS study variations of our welfare payments for people in student areas. My particular, I want to, around John Quiggin's point, the love for means testing in the Labor Party in Australia and amongst many of the policy, the bureaucracy particularly, they're pushing more to limit the age pension in Australia, to take away the age pension from anybody who owns their own home, because currently your own home doesn't count towards the assets test for your eligibility for the age pension in Australia. Many people think this is highly inequitable because you've got people sitting on $5 million homes getting a few $100 a week. So there's an ethical challenge there. So that's I know it's a slightly long question, but I want to get your reaction to what Varoufakis says about, I'm sure probably drawing upon you, about UBI being the only saviour really for the social democratic fiscal model, which has been destroyed by financialisation, and a bit of reaction to the debate in Australia around UBI.
Well, thank you very much for those very interesting points, and also thanks for co-hosting this. We all wish we were in the bookshop rather than virtually, but that's how it is. I was asked to do one of these with Jeremy Corbyn 3 or 4 weeks ago, and he was the discussant, and I was wondering where he was going to go. And we had a fantastic 2 hours. A lot of people were watching, and I was really touched at the end because I'd been an advisor to John McDonnell, and we'd lost badly, and we'd seen a liar mis-selling a product that is just disgraceful, but it was inevitable. And I was very touched by Jeremy when he said at the end, he thanks me for all the work I've done, blah, blah, blah. And then he said, "You've now converted me. I'm now convinced that we have to have a basic income." I wish, of course, that I'd been able to convert him emotionally last year, but I don't actually think it would have been the difference. John was openly advocating basic income, and we got a lot of support for that in itself. But we had everything against us. I think the Social Democrats have to transform themselves. I mean, now let's face it, we've seen 30 years of defeat. Even in the strongholds of social democracy, now the Swedish Social Democrats can't count on a third of political support, less than 30%. And the same in Britain. I mean, Britain, 26% of the electorate turned out to support Labour. You have to have the same problems. Everywhere, it's an occasional victory because of tiredness on the right or huge corruption that comes out or something, some accident, right? Unless the Social Democrats transform themselves, they are history. They've done their progressive bit. Now they're just clinging on to yesterday. And that, I don't think, makes a very exciting political agenda. I mean, I cannot tell you how many places where I've spoken. And the biggest applause I get is when I'm saying something like this, because the young are not convinced by that old Labourist model. Labourism is dead. They are dead men walking, as the famous saying goes. And Yanis, he has gradually moved. You quoted him 2016. I was in a debate with him in Zurich. But he's now, his new position, he's escaping gradually his umbilical cord, if you like, to Labourism. I wish he would go further. I wish he would, but he is moving. He is moving, and others are like that because more and more people realize the old social democracy is not going to work. We might get an occasional victory, but that's not going to be the agenda for the precariat. Unless you think from the precariat's perspective, what is it that excites them? What is it that will get them to become politically active and become the leaders of tomorrow? It won't be labourism. I'm afraid I've had to tell trade union leaders in various places, I said the one way I can clear the room when I'm talking to a precariat audience is to start talking about unions. They go for the bar. They'll rush for the bar. That is terrible because I believe in unions. The unions have to transform themselves too. And the way the TUC in Britain and other countries have supported this furlough scheme, which is revoltingly regressive, it's just tragic. So for me, this is a pivotal moment when people who have a public voice like Yanis and who are there, and I've just lost a good friend who was one of those public voices. He was converted to basic income, David Graeber. He's just died, and he died prematurely. He's only 59. But we need more public voices that are courageous enough to say yesterday is not good enough. And that's where we are today. That's where we are today. That's a long answer to a short question, but apologies for that.
That was a very long question, a brilliant answer. Thank you very much for it.
Thank you. I think we'll have one last question from Shelley.
It's like a little child there. That child needs basic income in the future.
Oh, did you want me to read my question out?
Yes, is that all right?
Oh, okay. It's way back. I just wanted to ask you, Guy, did you envisage us having a peasants' revolt or a French-style revolution? Because I remember some of the unions, their actions here in Melbourne in the 1970s, and I'm sorry, but they were pretty bloody brutish, and they brought the city to a standstill on more than one occasion. So although I do also believe in unions, they have now been they're now toothless, absolutely.
Of course. Well, look, I in my book, The Corruption of Capitalism, the last chapter is called The Precariats Revolt. I think we do need some sort of revolt because we won't get change unless we exert pressure. And pressure means we've got to be taking public action. Unions have got to be transformed, as I said. For the moment, they are not helpful. And as you've said very correctly, they're toothless and feebled and run mostly by old men who should be pensioned off, with due respect. But the essence of the Precariats Revolt, it is about creating a sense of future again, recreating a sense of future, recreating an ecologically, now I don't like the word sustainable, an ecologically exciting future. I'm writing a book on the Blue Commons to complement the Plunder of the Commons book. And I see there the opportunity of reviving commoning. The word has gone out of the English language. In fact, if you type it, it automatically corrects you to making it communing, right? But commoning is about shared activity. It's about work and leisure melded together. It stands in contrast to labor and in contrast to most forms of work. The sense of sharing and being participant and being a commoner is something that we need to see revived. And in a funny sort of way, I believe this is happening in the pandemic. The shutdowns, the enforced self-isolation is actually inducing a return to our roots in some respects. And I think this is an exciting thing, and I hope I conveyed this in Blunder, that we need to revive commoning. And I think that's something that Australians actually relate to. They relate to the land, they relate to nature, or the better type of Australians, not the neoliberals in Sydney, but the basics, you know, the people who want to relate to the earth, the sky, the fish, the animals, the sense of nature and so on. And I think that's the Precariats' agenda, because they don't suffer from the false consciousness of labour. They are not indoctrinated to think that the summit of life is to be in a full-time job all the time. They'll do jobs because that's instrumental, but that's not in their psyche as the zenith of life. And I think that's where we should be going. And you know, when I speak to a young audience, they get it. They get it. So should we all. But thanks for that question.
Wonderful. Well, I think we'll wrap it up for the night. But did you have any last words that you wanted to say?
Well, I hope some of you can see some of my books. I wish your bookshop every success, and we need radical bookshops, and we just need to keep up. Thanks, David. we need to keep up the ideas of reading and reflection. One of the terrible tragedies of the neoliberal era is the loss of respect for contemplation and reflection through reading. And that is so essential to avoid the crudeness of the Trumps and the manipulation of language. And so I wish you every success.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Guy. I hope everyone enjoyed it tonight. I loved it, and probably my favorite talk from this year so far. But everyone, if you wanted to write a little message, say goodbye to Guy in the last couple of minutes, you can have a little while too.
Thanks very much. Cheers. I hope to come back one day. Cheers.